Hi all, today we're going to do a brief overview of disorders of childhood and autism spectrum disorders. Many of you may take courses in the future specifically focused on childhood disorders because they are somewhat distinct than adult disorders. But today I just wanted to provide you with a bit of an overview so you have a sense of how some of these are presented in childhood. We kind of have done a little bit of an overhaul of the DSM, and so we've kind of looked at disorders from a developmental perspective. And so we wanted to make sure that we understood how psychopathology developed from a developmental perspective, and some of the behaviors that we see in childhood are very normative, even though if people behave like that as adults, obviously that would not be normative. And the DSM also talks about the relationship between child and adult psychopathology. So some disorders are unique to children, such as separation anxiety disorder, and some disorders are primarily childhood disorders like oppositional defiant disorders, but then they may continue into adulthood as a more severe form, kind of like conduct disorders. You also see that with ADHD. It's more impactful in childhood, but we know that adults also have ADHD and it can continue into adulthood, although adults develop better coping strategies to deal with some of these symptoms. And we see some disorders, which we're not going to necessarily focus on today, but they're present in both children and adults, such as depression and anxiety, and sometimes these are manifested differently. For example, depression, we know, as we've talked about, that adult depression is kind of, withdrawal. We often see with children a lot more irritability and acting out behavior when they're experiencing depression. So the DSM-5 kind of did, as I mentioned, a bit of an overhaul in the childhood disorders, and they separated them into neurodevelopmental disorders and then disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. And so they also provided new names for disorders. For example, mental retardation, which probably makes you cringe now when you hear it, is now called intellectual developmental disorder. So those are people with IQs below 70, which is 2 standard deviations below the norm, as well as social and occupational problems in functioning. And what has been most controversial is kind of the change to the neurodevelopmental disorders and the autism spectrum disorders, whereby autistic disorder and Asperger's disorder and PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, are now all combined into autism spectrum disorders. And so there's been a lot of controversy in the field because many people were diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, and now they fall into this autism spectrum, or they no longer qualify for a diagnosis, which can have good and bad. So this kind of shows you how the DSM has changed. So mental retardation is now intellectual developmental disorder. Learning disorders stayed the same. Pervasive developmental disorders, autism, Asperger's, and PDD, NOS are now in what's called autism spectrum disorders. Motor skills disorders are now called motor disorders. Communication disorders stayed the same. ADHD stayed the same. Feeding disorders, which some of you will be talking about in your presentations of infancy or early childhood, are the same, but can also include anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorders. And conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder now fall under that broader disruptive impulse control disorder and conduct disorder category. And then we now separate the other disorders of infancy and childhood and separation anxiety disorders into these anxiety disorders. And then selective mutism has moved into the communication disorders. So let's start off by talking about ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Many of you probably have heard of this, have seen classmates or even yourselves experiencing some of these symptoms growing up. These are excessive levels of activity. Now, if you've ever been around young kids, you will see that most of them experience excessive levels of activity, and as a very tired parent, I can tell you that many kids, including my own, have excessive levels of activity. But this is kind of above and beyond that. And like all kids are very active, but you'll see that kids with ADHD cannot sit still. For example, you'll see things like fidgeting, squirming, running around, inappropriate, incessant talking, like they cannot stop talking. I remember I did a testing once where they had to do like a monotonous task, and I was watching through a window of this kid doing this testing, and he just could not sit still. He was like literally bouncing off the walls, jumping up and down and moving all over the round. Kids with ADHD often get very easily distracted and they have difficulty concentrating, which impacts their ability to function well in the classroom. You'll see things like careless mistakes. They don't read the question carefully. They can't follow instructions and they're forgetful. These will be kids who have 20 pairs of mittens throughout the year because they keep losing them. They forget their homework at home. A teacher gives them instructions, but because they're not following or they're distracted, they don't pay attention. So these kids are not unintelligent. They're generally quite, of average intelligence or above. But the problem is because they have difficulty focusing or with attention, the information is not encoded. So here are the diagnostic criteria according to the DSM-5 for ADHD. So they have to meet criteria for either inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, or both. So you can have the inattentive type, the hyperactive type, or you can have the inattentive and hyperactive type. So in order to have this diagnosis for inattention, you have to be 17 and younger, and then 6 or more of these symptoms must be present for at least 6 months and be inconsistent with the child's developmental level. And that's what we talked about. Like, so a lot of these behaviors are normative at various stages, but they have to impact their social and academic activities. And it has to occur often, meaning that it's happening more often than not, so more than 50% of the time. So you have to have 6 or more of these. Fails to pay close attention to details, has trouble sustaining attention, doesn't seem to listen to when spoken directly, fails to follow through on instructions, and fails to finish schoolwork or chores, has trouble getting organized, avoids or dislikes doing things that require sustained focus or thinking, loses things frequently, is easily distracted by other things, and forgets things. Again, all of us have all of these things at various points in time, or many, and most kids have all of these things at most points in time. The key thing here is that it's affecting their social and academic functioning, and they have to be happening most of the time or happening often, and they have to have at least 6 of them. For the hyperactivity, impulsivity, you have to have 6 or more of these symptoms. They have to be present for 6 months, again, inconsistent with the child's developmental level, and have a negative impact on their social and academic activities, and they have to be happening often. So again, fidgeting with hands, feet, or squirming in chair, frequently leaves chair when seating is expected, so during class time they're often up and down out of their chair, running or climbing excessively, trouble playing or engaging in activities quietly. They act like they're on the go or are driven by a motor. They talk excessively, blurt out answers before questions are completed, trouble waiting or taking turns, interrupts or intrudes what others are doing. So if you've ever been in a kindergarten classroom, many and all of these behaviors are quite normative. But again, we're talking about developmental level, so this is not normative for a kid in grade 4 or 5, for example. And they have to impact social and academic activities and be happening often, which is generally more than 50% of the time for a period of 6 months. So in terms of specifiers, so you can either diagnose somebody with the predominantly inattentive type if they have more of the inattentive symptoms, predominantly hyperactive impulsive type if they have primarily the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, or they can have the combined type where they meet criteria. They have the 6 of both the inattentive and hyperactive, so they would be ADHD-C. You then want to specify the severity, mild, which is basically just 6 symptoms or slightly more, and this only minor impairment. Moderate is somewhere between mild and severe is that they have the majority of the symptoms are endorsed and it's significantly impacting their functioning in their social and school situations. In terms of differential diagnosis, oftentimes ADHD can be mistaken for conduct disorder. We're seeing also with young children, ADHD or the inattention hinders kids from developing language because you have to focus in order to encode and to learn, and therefore they're getting diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders as well. We see, in order to differentiate kind of ADHD from conduct disorders, you see more off-task behaviors than actually defiant behaviors. And so we're seeing more of the behaviors in the school setting, but they're functioning better at home, and it's not necessarily disruptive behavior. Whereas conduct disorders, we'll talk about, it's more aggressive. They're acting out in most settings, and you'll typically see family hostility and antisociality in the family as well. So we often see ADHD comorbid with anxiety and depression, and this happens because they have difficulty functioning in social and school situations, and so they're not doing well in school. It's estimated that it impacts between 3 and 7% of the population worldwide. We see it more commonly in girls more commonly, sorry, in boys than girls. This could be gender bias in terms of diagnosis because we tend, to accept, we tend to be more critical of boys' behavior. They tend to be a little bit more disruptive to begin with. So when they're above and beyond, then we're more likely to diagnose them. But a lot of these symptoms persist beyond childhood. So numerous longitudinal studies now have shown that between 65 and 80% of individuals still exhibit some of these symptoms as adults. And 60% of adults who had ADHD as children continue to meet criteria for ADHD in remission as adults. So this is for many people, kind of a lifelong disorder. They do manage to deal with it more effectively as they grow up and they learn strategies to mitigate it. So here we talked about what's normal and what's not normal. So you'll see that these are for our kids, these are for adolescents with ADHD. So again, like in my kindergarten, when I go to see my son in kindergarten, most of the kids are blurting out answers. In high school, that's not necessarily normal. So we're seeing that while it does happen with kids without ADHD, the percentage of kids with ADHD who demonstrate these symptoms is significantly higher. And this is obviously easier seen in adolescents because we're expecting kind of quasi-adult-like behaviors. With the younger kids, it's harder to distinguish. And so, generally we don't diagnose before the age of about 6 or 7 when they're in kind of grade 2 or so, where they're required to sit still and be a little more slow, and they're capable of doing that developmentally. So in terms of the etiology, when we look at adoption and twin studies, that we see that there's heritability between 70 and 80%, and that some of the dopamine genes are implicated, which has led people to kind of use medication. We also see that there, in addition to the gene association, that some of these genes are only expressed when prenatal maternal nicotine or alcohol is present. This is one of the reasons why we tell women not to smoke or drink when they're pregnant, because we see kids that are born with higher levels of ADHD type symptomology. In terms of neurobiological factors, the dopaminergic areas are smaller in kids with ADHD, such as their frontal lobes, which are required for planning, the caudate nucleus, and the globus pallidus. And we see poor performance on tests of frontal lobe functioning. Again, our frontal lobe is kind of what helps us disinhibit our impulsive behaviors. And so these kids may have smaller frontal lobes and poor performance generally with frontal lobe dependent tasks. We also see higher levels of ADHD with low birth weight kids, and as I mentioned, with maternal tobacco and alcohol use. There is some evidence, although limited, that food additives or coloring can have a little bit of impact on hyperactivity behavior. There was, everybody says sugar causes ADHD. That's actually a myth, which has been debunked. But we do know that smoking while pregnant can cause ADHD symptoms. So therefore, that's why we really strongly encourage women not to smoke while pregnant. There's also impacts of the parent-child relationship, and this can be a function of the child as well because it induces certain behaviors in the parent, but the parents tend to be more kind of the domineering type and have more negative interactions with the parents, which is part of what we target in treatment. It could be kind of an interaction with the parents having some of these criteria or diagnostic symptoms themselves, but we don't think that these necessarily cause the ADHD behaviors, but they can kind of exacerbate them or maintain them. So our best psychological treatments are parent training. So it's not necessarily working with the child, but working with the parents on how to help the child cope, how to structure the environment to best meet the needs of the child, and doing proper reinforcement and punishment strategies. Also, in terms of classroom management, so kids are given brief assignments, immediate feedback. They can have exercise breaks so that they can, get their wiggles out, things like that. And that seems to help kids work in a classroom environment. So let's talk a little bit about conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is typically diagnosed in adolescence. It's a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or or other age-appropriate social norms or rules are violated, and they're manifested by the presence of at least 3 of the following 15 criteria for 12 months. So conduct disorder is seen kind of as a prequel for antisocial personality disorder. These are the kids who are getting involved with the juvenile justice system. So this is above and beyond the average adolescent shenanigans. This is like getting into serious trouble, as you'll see. So they have to have 3 of the following 15: aggression to people and animals, often bullies, threatens, or intimidates others, often initiates physical fights, used a weapon that causes serious harm to others, has been physically cruel to people, has been physically cruel to animals, has stolen while confronted a victim, has forced somebody into sexual activity against their will, destruction of property, has deliberately engaged in fire setting with the intention of causing serious damage, has deliberately destroyed others' property, and then the deceitfulness or theft, has broken into somebody else's house, building, or car, often lies to obtain goods or favors to avoid obligations, such as kind of conning type behavior, has stolen items without confronting the victim, like shoplifting, breaking and entering, and forgery. There's also serious violation of rules. They're staying out overnight, running away from home, and often skipping school. So again, some of these behaviors are normative in adolescence, but look at the severity of these, and they have to have 3 of these happening frequently for a period of 6 months. So these disturbances are causing clinically significant impairments in social, academic, or occupational functioning, such as kids are getting suspended, they're not making friends, they're getting into frequent fights, they're ending up in prison or in jail, getting arrested. And if you want to diagnose this in somebody over the age of 18, they cannot meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So then in terms of specifiers, it's either childhood onset type, where you're seeing this before the age of 10, and we'll talk about ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, in a second. The adolescent onset type, or unspecified onset, where the criteria for a diagnosis are met, but it's not clear when it happened, either before or after 10. You then also need to specify with limited prosocial emotions. So this is kind of getting at the psychopathy. So they have to display at least 2 of the following characteristics for at least 12 months. And so these have to be kind of, in addition to just your observations, they have to be kind of based on self-report, but also observation by parents, teachers, coworkers, or extended family members and peers. So they have to be unconcerned about performance, so they don't care about how they're doing at school. They don't put any effort into performing well. They have to have shallow or deficient affect, so they don't show feelings or emotions. Or when the emotions expression is used, it's only for kind of some sort of gain, so to manipulate or intimidate others. They demonstrate a lack of remorse or guilt, and they're callous. So this is, as you can see, kind of the prequel to like psychopathy, or as an adult antisocial personality disorder. We then, because with the DSM, we're using these continuums, you either specify mild, moderate, or severe. In terms of comorbidity, we see high comorbidities with substance abuse, which typically go along with delinquent behavior, as well as with anxiety and depression. So often, like, a lot of these symptoms can result from, difficulties in the home. The child becomes depressed, and therefore they start acting out. Although we often see conduct disorder preceding depression and anxiety, sometimes these are done to get attention from the environment because they're not getting it from their parents. And then because the attention is negative, it can lead to symptoms of depression and anxiety. We see the prevalence ranging anywhere from 4 to 16% for boys and 1 to 9% for girls. So it's more prevalent in boys than girls. Again, that could be due to diagnostic bias, and that we tend to kind of attribute girls acting out behavior to more things like depression, whereas boys are just, more, we see them as being quote unquote more bad. So there are 2 distinct types of conduct disorder. There's the life course, which is like really those who end up in the criminal justice system with a persistent lifelong pattern of antisocial behavior, which we see much more commonly in boys than girls. Then there's the adolescent limited, where it's like a troubled kind of adolescent who can then turn themselves around in adulthood. So follow-up longitudinal studies of those with the life course type, they get into more serious problems in their early adulthood. They don't perform well in school. They've often dropped out. We see neuropsychological deficits, comorbidity with ADHD. We see more problems in the family, poor physical health, lower socioeconomic status, and more violent behavior. So you see here that a lot of these arrests are peaking in this young adulthood phase. And so this is kind of the adolescent limited, and then some it burns out, although we do see that some people are having more of a lifelong course. So we do see that there's some genetic factors. The twin data shows some mixed results. And the adoption studies that we have done looked at criminal behavior, not conduct disorder. So we don't necessarily have a good basis, but meta-analysis of twin and adoption studies have suggested that between 40 and 50% of antisocial personality behavior is heritable. The genetic emphasis is stronger when these behaviors begin in childhood as opposed to adolescence. So when we see these behaviors with very young children, but it's kind of a combination of genetics and environmental interaction. So kids with this genetic predisposition plus deficient family environments are more likely to develop conduct disorder. In terms of neurobiological factors, we see poor verbal skills, higher difficulty with executive functioning, lower IQ, and lower levels of resting skin conductance and heart rate. So these people are not easily these are the sensation-seeking people. They don't get easily kind of flustered or excited. In terms of psychological factors, we see deficient moral development, specifically remorse. Now, this could be due to poor parenting, but it could also be developmental. We see modeling and reinforcement of aggressive behaviors in the home, harsh and inconsistent parenting, lack of parental monitoring, and we see cognitive biases in these individuals where neutral acts are perceived as being hostile by others. So Dodge had this cognitive model whereby you see that ambiguous acts are interpreted as hostile, which then results in hostile actions. Then people retaliate, which then causes the person to become more aggressive, and then reinforces the fact that the world is a hostile place, which then kind of, it becomes like a vicious cycle. We also see influences from peers where they're rejected and they start to affiliate with deviant peers. More sociocultural factors, so we see this more in poor and urban environments. And while we do see higher levels in African American males, it's not related to race or ethnicity, but rather to poorer neighborhoods. And so, that's not an artifact of race or ethnicity, but rather a fact of poverty. So in terms of treatment for conduct disorder, family intervention, so working with the family to train them on positive pro-social behaviors. They've seen tremendous success with what's called multi-systemic therapy, and if you take my treatment and rehabilitation of offenders course, we'll talk more about this. But it's an intensive community-based service where people are coming into the home to work with the parents. They work with the school as well as the child. It's many, many hours of intervention at all of these levels. That's why it's called multi-systemic. But they have seen significant decreases in delinquent behavior and sex offending behavior with adolescents when they use these types of interventions. So oppositional defiant disorder is kind of somewhere between being kind of a mischievous kid and having conduct disorder. So you have to have 4 of the following symptoms for 6 months, and it has to be exhibited during interactions with other children who are not siblings. So anger, irritability symptoms, losing the temper, touchy or easily annoyed, angry or resentful, arguing with authority, defying or refusing to comply with requests, deliberately annoying others, blaming others for their mistakes, and being spiteful at least twice within the past 6 months. It's causing significant distress and impairment in social or other occupational or educational functioning, and it's not happening exclusively in the course of a psychotic substance abuse disorder, depressive or bipolar disorder. So a lot of those behaviors are normative for kids, but again, it's happening a lot more frequently than not in kids under 5, but several times a week in kids over 5. You then specify if the symptoms are mild, moderate, or severe. Lifetime prevalence, we see 10.2% in overall, with more happening in males than females, and at least there's comorbidity with at least one other disorder, and especially mood, anxiety, impulse control, and substance use disorders. We're going to finish our discussion today of childhood disorders with the autism spectrum disorder. So, as I mentioned at the onset of the lecture, DSM-5 combined multiple diagnoses into one. So before, there used to be autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, and childhood disintegrative disorder. These are now all combined under one global kind of umbrella called the autism spectrum disorders. What they found is that this working group was that the research didn't really support these distinctive categories, that many of these disorders kind of existed on a continuum, really varying by severity, and they exhibited many of the same clinical features. And so instead of having these separate distinct diagnostic criteria, which had poor reliability, they now combine them all in one. So you can see here in the DSM-4 and 4TR, we had autistic disorder, Asperger's, PDD, NOS, Rett's, and childhood disintegrative disorder. These are all now combined under the global autism spectrum disorder. So in terms of autism spectrum disorders, some of the key hallmark characteristics that you'll see are communication deficits. So those kids with autism ASD, you'll see early language disturbances where they are late to learn to talk, or they will engage in echolalia, where they will have immediate or delayed repeating of what is heard, that kind of like mimic. Although this is also typical of normal developing children, so it's only when it's excessive that it's a problem. You'll see things like pronoun reversal, where they'll refer to themselves as he or she, and there'll be the literal use of words. I'm reading the books, I don't know if you've ever read them, but called Amelia Bedelia to my daughter right now, and she does not understand idiomatic expressions. Everything is very literal. So like, for example, last night there was something about they won the contest under the wire, and she was looking around for where the wire was. So there's the inability to understand idiomatic expressions, for example. You'll also see repetitive or ritualistic acts. So they can become upset when routines are altered. But again, this is typical of normal children. So again, it has to be excessive. They can engage in obsessional play, so that they only play with one type of object. You'll see ritualistic body movements, so kind of flapping of the hands or arms. But you'll see that they may become attached to inanimate objects like keys or rocks. You've probably heard about autism being on the rise, and you'll see increases in the prevalence. One of the latest studies that I saw, this chart speaks to 2014, but the figures are from 2010. We're going to see even higher numbers now that they've combined all those different disorders in probably the next prevalence study. If you look, when we were, at least when I was young, there were a lot of children that were labeled kind of formally mentally retarded. Now the number of children that are labeled with intellectual disabilities has gone down dramatically, and now these children are now being labeled as on the autism spectrum. And so what the thinking process is that a lot of, the diagnoses are changing. We're also doing a lot of early intervention, and these things are being kind of identified earlier, or the kind of what is the risk of identifying somebody if you get rid of the diagnosis later. It's not as risky as not giving the diagnosis, because we know early intervention works. So in terms of comorbidity with autism spectrum disorders, we see that low IQ below 70 is common. So there's a high comorbidity with intellectual disabilities. Kids who have ASD and low IQ have poor prognosis. It's estimated that 1 out of 68 children will be diagnosed on the spectrum, and it's found across all socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial groups. So that leads to more of a biological basis for the disorder. Um, and that it's stable, so that it's not something that will change across the lifetime. In terms of prognosis, kids with higher IQs or who learn to speak before the age of 6 have the best outcomes, and many learn to live independently, can go to college, etc. So in order to be diagnosed with an ASD, you have to meet criteria A, B, C, and D. So A is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across contexts is manifested by the following: deficits in social-emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors, deficits in maintaining and understanding relationships, ranging from difficulties in adjusting to behaviors to suit social context, to difficulty sharing imaginative play, making friends, or absence of interest in peers. So you'll see these are very, very broad, and a lot of this, so it's you can get diagnoses even depending on how this is interpreted. B is a restrictive, repetitive pattern of behavior, interests, or activities is manifested by at least 2 of the following: stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, insistence on sameness and flexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, hyper or hypo, meaning too much or too little reactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So the symptoms have to be present in early adulthood, but may not fully manifest until the social demands exceed the limited capacity. So you may not observe some of these things until school, and the symptoms together limit and impair everyday functioning. So then you can distinguish between mild, moderate, and severe. So level 1 is requiring support, level 2 is requiring substantial support, and level 3 is requiring very substantial support, so that they cannot function without anybody helping them. It's estimated that about 80% of ASD is accounted for by heritable factors. So in twin studies, that we see anywhere from 47 to 90% concordance for monozygotic twins and up to 20% concordance by dizygotic twins. It's thought that there's a genetic flaw, deletion on chromosome 16. We're also seeing differences in brain size, where children who have, and adults who have ASD, have larger than normal brains. So what our brains generally do is they prune neurons. They're kind of hypothesizing that people who have ASD have what are called overgrown brains, where this neural pruning doesn't happen. And so there's kind of an overgrowth in the frontal, temporal, and cerebellar regions, which are linked to language, social, and emotional functioning. We also see those who have larger amygdalas as having more social and communicative problems. So in terms of treatment, like pretty much all of the childhood disorders, behavioral and psychological interventions are actually more promising than drugs. And the earlier the treatment, the better the outcome. Lovaas was kind of the pioneer in what's called applied behavior analysis. So that's where you do discrete trial learning, where kids are taught to break down tasks into simple functioning, and they're rewarded for untasked functioning. And these are then grouped together to form more complex tasks. This, combined with parent training and education, as I'll call applied behavior analysis, has shown to have quite dramatic effects and can significantly increase the functioning of many kids who have been diagnosed on the spectrum. Pivotal response treatment is focusing on increasing child motivation and responsiveness as opposed to discrete behaviors. So this is kind of rewarding the motivation and response rather than the actual behavior. Joint attention interventions and symbolic play can be used to improve attention and expressive skills. So all of this is done with intense behavior therapy. It's actually recommended that kids on the spectrum receive about 40 hours of intervention a week, which is extremely intensive. If kids have severe behavior problems where they're hurting themselves or others, antipsychotics can be prescribed, which can reduce some of the aggression and stereotype motor behaviors, but it doesn't work to improve language or interpersonal relationships. That kind of is done with